George Clooney didn't rise to the top. He was rebuilt there. 12 years of rejections in silence. A marriage that collapsed before the world even knew his name. An accident that left him seconds away from permanent paralysis. And a decision that shocked all of Hollywood, made at 53 years old. For decades, the world believed it knew this man. The face on every cover, the effortless smile, the accidental billionaire who sold tequila for $1 billion. But behind every achievement exists a version the cameras never caught. What drives a man to walk away from everything he built and start over from nothing? How does someone survive 12 years of invisibility without letting the silence become the final answer? And what did a crash on a Sardinian road reveal that 35 years of fame never could? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning, to a boy from Kentucky with $300 in his pocket and a quiet, stubborn refusal to disappear. George Timothy Clooney was born on May 6, 1961, in Lexington, Kentucky, into a family that wore its ambitions openly and its wounds quietly. His father, Nick Clooney, was a television journalist and news anchor, charming, respected, and perpetually chasing the next opportunity. His mother, Nina Bruce, a former beauty queen, carried herself with grace and warmth. But their household moved constantly, restlessly, following Nick's career from one small market to the next. Augusta, Georgia. Cincinnati, Ohio. Back to Kentucky. A childhood measured not in routes, but in relocations, in new schools and strange hallways, and the exhausting ritual of proving yourself to rooms that had already decided who mattered. For a boy like George, restless and sharp and hungry for attention, the instability had a double edge. On one side, it had taught him to read people fast, to charm a room before it could dismiss him, to make himself likable as a survival skill. On the other, it denied him the steady ground that confidence requires. He was always the new kid, always the one still learning the rules everyone else already knew. And then there was his face. At 14, George Clooney was diagnosed with Bell's palsy, a condition that caused partial paralysis of the left side of his face. For months, he could not smile symmetrically, could not close his left eye fully, could not eat without humiliation. In the hallways of Augusta High School, teenage cruelty did what it always does. It found the wound and pressed. Hard. He was mocked, pointed at. The boy whose face didn't work right. He later admitted that the experience was defining not because it broke him, but because it forced him to develop something more durable than good looks. He learned to be funny. Genuinely, disarmingly funny. Not as performance, but as armor. If he could make them laugh before they could mock him, the weapon lost its edge. It was a lesson that would serve him for the rest of his life. In audition rooms, on film sets, in diplomatic negotiations, and in the quiet aftermath of public disasters. His aunt, Rosemary Clooney, was already a star, a genuine one, a recording artist and actress whose voice had filled living rooms across America in the 1950s. Growing up in her orbit gave George his first real glimpse of what fame looked like from the inside. And what he saw was not glamour. It was work. It was discipline. It was also, he would discover later, profound fragility. Rosemary's career had collapsed in the 1960s under the weight of personal crisis and shifting tastes. Her long, painful road back to relevance taught George something no acting class ever could: that the entertainment industry has no loyalty. And that survival requires something deeper than talent. When George left Kentucky for Los Angeles in 1982, he was 21 years old, driving a rusted 1976 Monte Carlo with $300 in his pocket and the quiet, stubborn certainty that he would make it. What he found instead was a city that did not notice him. He slept on couches. He delivered newspapers. He sold women's suits and cut tobacco, and did every undignified thing a young man does when the dream refuses to arrive on schedule. Auditions came and went without callbacks. The small parts on forgettable shows dissolved without leaving a trace. He would later describe those years with disarming honesty, not as romantic struggle, but as grinding, demoralizing invisibility. The kind that doesn't inspire, the kind that simply wears you down. He auditioned for the same roles repeatedly and lost them to men who looked more like what the industry had decided a star should look like. He watched contemporaries land breaks that never came his way. He smiled through the meetings, charmed the rooms, and drove home alone to apartments that held nothing but the echo of what hadn't happened yet. The rejections accumulated not like individual blows, but like slow erosion. Each one small enough to dismiss, all of them together, carving something dangerous. Doubt. You're the kind that doesn't announce itself, but settles quietly into the space between ambition and reality, whispering with increasing confidence that perhaps the verdict was already in. He came close to quitting more than once. In 1987, after 5 years of near misses and dead ends, he told a close friend he was considering walking away entirely. Not with drama, just with exhaustion. The industry had not said no with cruelty. It had said nothing at all. And silence, as George had learned in childhood, can be the heaviest verdict of all. What kept him was not a sudden break, but a refusal so quiet it barely registered as courage. He simply would not let invisibility be the final word. He had watched his father chase opportunity across state lines his entire childhood. He had watched his aunt rebuild from ruins. And he had learned, in the hallways of too many schools, that the only defense against humiliation was to keep moving. So he kept moving. Small roles accumulated into slightly less small roles. A recurring part on the sitcom The Facts of Life. A few episodes here, a guest appearance there. Nothing that announced itself as a turning point. Nothing that silenced the doubt. But forward motion, even when it feels like standing still. And then, in 1994, after over a decade of near invisibility, a phone call changed everything. ER was casting a new ensemble medical drama for NBC. The role was Dr. Doug Ross, charming, complicated, morally inconsistent, and magnetic. The kind of character that required an actor who could make flawed feel heroic. The producers had seen hundreds of faces. They chose George Clooney's, and the show premiered in September 1994 and became an immediate phenomenon. Within months, George Clooney was not just recognizable. He was unavoidable. The face on every magazine, the name in every conversation. Overnight, the Invisible Man from Kentucky became the most talked-about actor on American television. But here is what the overnight success story always omits. It was not overnight. It was 12 years. 12 years of couches and callbacks that never came. 12 years of driving past billboards advertising the careers of men who had started in the same rooms. 12 years of keeping a refusal so quiet it looked, from the outside, like patience. The forge of rejection had done its work. What emerged from it was not just a star. It was a man who understood, at a cellular level, and that nothing given easily is ever held tightly, and that the most durable foundation for any empire is the memory of what it felt like to have nothing at all. The phone call that changed everything came with a price George Clooney had not anticipated. Fame, when it finally arrives after 12 years of silence, does not arrive quietly. It arrives like a flood, sudden, total, and indifferent to whether you are ready. By 1995, ER was the most watched drama on American television, and George Clooney was its face. Not just a cast member. The face. The one the cameras found instinctively. The one the audience followed home in their minds after the credits rolled. He was on magazine covers he hadn't posed for. In a cultural moment he had waited over a decade to reach. And now that he was inside it, something unexpected became clear. It felt nothing like he had imagined. If friends from the lean years noticed a man who smiled in every photograph and said very little when the cameras were gone. The loneliness of invisibility had been replaced by something he hadn't expected. The loneliness of omnipresence. What the headlines of 1994 rarely mentioned was that George Clooney had already lived through one of the defining devastations of his personal life. In 1989, at 28 years old, he had married actress Talia Balsam. For 4 years, they tried. But the relentless churn of 2 careers and the particular loneliness of a man still chasing something he couldn't quite name ground the marriage down slowly. Then, all at once. They divorced in 1993, 1 year before ER. 1 year before the world decided George Clooney was the man who had everything. But he blamed himself, not with performed humility, but with the specific uncomfortable candor of a man who had examined the evidence and reached an unflattering conclusion. He had not been present. He had been consumed by ambition, by the grinding anxiety of a career that refused to ignite. He made a decision he would keep for the next 20 years. He would not marry again. Not as a wound dressed up as philosophy, but as a conclusion drawn from evidence. He had failed at marriage. He would not put another person through that. And he would not put himself through it again. The declaration became part of his public identity. George Clooney, Hollywood's most eligible bachelor. What it concealed was more complicated. A man who had learned that intimacy was a territory where his defenses didn't hold, and who had decided the cleanest solution was to stop going there. Meanwhile, the professional empire was being built with a discipline that contradicted every Playboy headline. Then, in 1997, came the film that nearly ended everything before it had properly begun. Batman and Robin was catastrophic. The script was hollow, the tone was wrong, and George Clooney found himself publicly associated with one of the most derided films of the decade. Critics were merciless. Audiences stayed away. He did not defend the film. He did not deflect. He looked directly at the camera in interview after interview and said simply that he had killed the Batman franchise. Not with self-pity, not with excuses, but with the dry, a deliberate humor of a man who had learned in childhood that the fastest way through humiliation is straight through it. The public found his candor disarming. The disaster became, paradoxically, a kind of credential. The recovery required precision. Out of Sight, in 1998, with Steven Soderbergh, was the turning point. An actor capable of stillness and ambiguity rather than just charm. What followed was a decade of deliberate construction. Three Kings, O Brother, Where Art Thou, the Ocean's Trilogy, Syriana, for which he gained 35 pounds and won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in 2006. Michael Clayton confirmed what serious observers had suspected since Out of Sight. This was a filmmaker's actor, one who chose roles for their weight, not their safety. Soon by the mid-2000s, he was one of the handful of figures whose name alone could greenlight a film. And through all of it, the personal life remained carefully, almost architecturally, sealed. Then came the accident that shattered the architecture entirely. In September 2018, on the island of Sardinia, George Clooney was riding a scooter on a coastal road when a car turned directly into his path. He was thrown over the handlebars and landed on the asphalt with an impact that came within a margin of causing permanent spinal damage. He was airlifted to a hospital. And for several hours, the question was not about recovery. It was about whether recovery was possible at all. He later described the moment with flat precision. He saw the car. He understood what was about to happen. And then there was pavement. For a man who had built his entire identity around control, the accident was a confrontation with a truth he had been successfully avoiding. He was not invincible. The body that had carried him through 35 years of professional reinvention could be taken from him in 2 seconds by a wrong turn on a coastal road. But something else was happening simultaneously. Something the accident interrupted, and in interrupting, clarified. By 2018, George Clooney was no longer the confirmed bachelor of Hollywood legend. 3 years earlier, in 2014, he had done the thing he had publicly and repeatedly sworn he would never do. He had married. Her name was Amal Alamuddin, not an actress, not a socialite, but one of the world's most respected human rights lawyers. A woman who had represented heads of state, argued before international tribunals, and whose work on genocide and press freedom carried a moral weight that no film career could approximate. He later described meeting her with an openness entirely inconsistent with the man who had spent 20 years constructing elegant distance. He said he had not been looking. He said it had happened before he understood what was happening. And then he said the thing that stopped every conversation it entered. He said she was the first person he had ever met who made him want to change his mind. They married in Venice in September of 2014. He was 53. She was 36. The man who had made a public philosophy of permanent bachelorhood stood in a Venetian palazzo and quietly dismantled it. It was not simply a marriage, and it was a recantation, a public acknowledgement that the architecture of emotional control he had maintained for 20 years had been, at its foundation, a response to fear rather than a reflection of preference. In June 2017, Amal gave birth to twins, Alexander and Ella. George Clooney, the eternal bachelor, became a father at 56. He later said that nothing in his life, not the Oscar, not the billion-dollar tequila sale, not the standing ovation at Cannes, had prepared him for the specific, overwhelming completeness of holding 2 children who looked at him as though the world began and ended with his presence. The scooter accident came 14 months later, and lying in a Sardinian hospital, George Clooney understood something that 35 years of professional triumph had never quite taught him. The empire, the films, the awards, the production deals, the villa, the fortune, was the scaffolding. Alexander and Ella and Amal were the building. He had spent his entire adult life constructing the scaffolding. The accident, in the blunt and impartial way that physical trauma delivers its lessons, made the distinction impossible to ignore. There is a version of George Clooney's story that ends with the Venetian wedding and the twins and the accident that clarified his priorities and calls it complete. The bachelor found family. The invincible found humility. A tidy conclusion. Emotionally satisfying, easily packaged. But that version omits the dimension of his life that has cost him the most. Not in comfort or convenience, but in safety, in sleep, in the particular, unrelenting weight of knowing that your convictions have placed your name on lists compiled by people who mean what they write. George Clooney has spent 3 decades using his platform in ways the industry quietly discourages. Not the safe activism of charity galas and awareness ribbons, but the kind that generates consequences. The kind that ends business relationships, provokes government responses, and produced documented threats serious enough to involve federal law enforcement. In 2006, while most of Hollywood was carefully avoiding geopolitical complexity, he traveled to Darfur and returned with footage and testimony he presented directly to the United Nations Security Council. He did not send a representative. He went. He sat in front of ambassadors from permanent member nations and described, in the specific and unsparing language of someone who had been present, what was happening to civilians the world was finding reasons to ignore. He co-founded the Satellite Sentinel Project, which used commercial satellite imagery to monitor military movements along the Sudan and South Sudan border and publish the findings publicly, effectively removing the government's ability to conduct certain operations invisibly. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was a surveillance operation funded by a film star, and it worked. The threats began arriving not long after. The FBI contacted his security team. Those close to him describe a sustained period in which the infrastructure of his daily life required adjustment in ways that were neither comfortable nor temporary. Additional security, modified travel protocols, the particular claustrophobia of understanding that the radius of safety around your family had contracted. He did not stop. In 2011, he was arrested outside the Sudanese embassy in Washington, D.C., during a protest against the blocking of humanitarian aid. He had known he would be arrested. He had arranged for cameras to be present, and he understood that his face in handcuffs would generate coverage that a press release never could. His father, Nick, was arrested alongside him. The journalist father and the film star son handcuffed together outside an embassy, using the only leverage they had in the way they had decided it deserved to be used. The activism never confined itself to a single cause: Syria, South Sudan, the refugee crisis in Europe, the Flint water crisis, where he and Amal contributed personal funds to legal efforts on behalf of residents whose children had been poisoned by lead in the municipal water supply. Each engagement was specific, researched, and sustained, and each carried costs that rarely appeared in the coverage of the cause itself. Studio executives who preferred their marquee assets politically neutral grew quietly difficult. And certain international markets found reasons to complicate his productions. He said, in a 2017 interview, that he had made a decision early in his public life that the platform was not his, that it belonged, in a meaningful sense, to the people who didn't have one, and that if using it cost him professionally, that was a cost he had priced in deliberately. The Casamigos sale arrived in the middle of all of this and illuminated something the activism story alone could not. In 2013, he and close friends Randa Gerber and Mike Meldman had begun producing a tequila for their own consumption, a bottle they could share at Como and Malibu without negotiating with a bar menu. The name came from the Spanish for House of Friends. By 2017, Casamigos had grown into one of the fastest-growing spirits brands in the world. Diageo made an offer that settled the question of its value with uncomfortable clarity: $1 billion. George Clooney, the man who had spent 35 years building a career on artistic credibility and political conviction, became a billionaire by accident, by tequila, by the simple act of making something he enjoyed and sharing it with people he loved. He noted later, with dry self-awareness, that he had worked for 35 years as an actor and been paid well for it. He had then spent 3 years making tequila with his friends and been paid more for that than for everything else combined. The philanthropic infrastructure around him expanded. The Clooney Foundation for Justice. He focused on education equity and legal representation for the most vulnerable, became one of the more substantive philanthropic operations connected to any public figure of his generation. The $1 billion did not make him more interested in wealth. It made him more interested in its velocity, in how fast he could convert it into something that outlasted him. By 60, the physical inventory told a story his filmography could not. The scooter accident had left residual damage that therapy improved, but never erased. The knee required ongoing management. Certain movements that had been automatic were now deliberate and occasionally painful. But it was not the knee that occupied his private attention most. It was time. He had become a father at 56. Alexander and Ella would be teenagers when he was 70. By adults when he was in his mid-70s, and George Clooney, who had spent his entire adult life in motion, had arrived at a stillness he had not chosen and could not entirely manage. He began to speak differently about age, not with performative acceptance, but with the specific honesty of someone confronting an arithmetic they cannot charm their way out of. He talked about wanting to be present for the twins in ways his own father, always chasing the next market, had not always been present for him. Fatherhood was teaching him, slowly and not always comfortably, that stillness could be the point rather than the absence of one. Amal was both the architect and the evidence of this instruction. A woman who moved through the world with more genuine purpose than anyone he had encountered, and who did so without the compulsive restlessness that had defined his own navigation. She was not still because she lacked ambition. She was still because she knew precisely where she was going. He watched her. He learned. The man who had spent 20 years building elegant distance from intimacy had found, in his 50s, that proximity was not the threat he had constructed it to be. That the specific vulnerability of being known, really known, was not an exposure to be managed, but a relief to be accepted. It had taken him a long time to get there. The Bell's palsy hallways, the couch surfing years, Talia balsam, the Batman suit, the Darfur footage, the FBI call, the handcuffs, the Sardinian asphalt. Every one of those experiences had been, in its own way, the same instruction. That the things worth having require the willingness to be broken by their loss. That the platform is not yours. That the building matters more than the scaffolding. He had spent 60 years learning what most people spend a lifetime avoiding. And he had learned it the only way durable knowledge ever arrives. Not in a classroom or an acceptance speech, but in the specific, unscheduled moments when life removes the option of pretending otherwise. In the hills above Los Angeles, in a house that does not announce itself from the street, George Clooney's mornings begin before the twins wake up. Not with strategy sessions or script notes or the machinery of empire management. With coffee. With the particular quiet of a house that is about to become loud. With the deliberate, almost ceremonial act of being present before the day demands it. He is 63 years old. His hair is fully silver now, and he wears it without apology. The face that launched 1,000 magazine covers carries its years openly. The lines around the eyes deeper, the jaw slightly softer, the overall effect not of diminishment, but of settlement. A man who has stopped negotiating with time and started simply living inside it. Alexander and Ella are 7. They do not know, in any meaningful sense, who their father is to the world outside their house. They know who he is at the breakfast table, who he is during homework, who he is when the bedtime story runs long because he keeps doing the voices and they keep asking for one more page. That version of George Clooney. The one who does the voices, who gets the Lego instructions wrong, who shows up to school events in sunglasses and hopes no one notices, is the one he has decided matters most. It is not a performance of humility. It is a conclusion drawn from evidence accumulated over 6 decades of learning what lasts. The Clooney Foundation for Justice has grown into one of the more substantive philanthropic operations connected to any public figure of his generation. Its focus is specific and deliberately unglamorous. Education equity in conflict zones, our access to legal representation for people who cannot afford it. Accountability mechanisms for those who abuse judicial systems to silence dissent. It is not the kind of philanthropy that generates gala coverage or lifetime achievement tributes. It is the kind that funds a teacher's salary in a refugee camp in Lebanon, that finances the legal defense of a journalist imprisoned in a country whose government has decided that the truth is a crime, that builds classrooms in communities where the alternative to education is recruitment into violence. Amal leads much of the operational work. George provides the infrastructure and, when necessary, the face. The asset that opens rooms that would otherwise stay closed. She has the expertise. He has the access. Together, they have built something that neither could have built alone. And the films continue, though with a selectivity that would have been unthinkable during the hungry years in Los Angeles. He no longer takes roles for their commercial safety or their franchise potential. He takes them because something in the material requires him specifically, because there is a quality of weathered intelligence, of earned complexity that certain stories need, and that he is now, at 63, better positioned to provide than at any previous point in his career. The Boys in the Boat, which he directed in 2023, was a return to a kind of storytelling he had always been drawn to. The examination of collective effort, of what ordinary people are capable of when the conditions demand their best. Critics noted something different in his directorial work now, a willingness to let silence carry weight. The work of a filmmaker who no longer needs to prove anything and has therefore become free to simply observe. Nick Clooney is 84 years old. He and his son speak regularly. The relationship between them has settled, over decades, into something that neither the restless relocations of George's childhood nor the distance of fame could ultimately prevent. Two men who understand each other across the particular gulf of a father's ambitions and a son's need to exceed them. George has said that one of the clearest measures of his own change is the conversation he can now have with his father that he could not have had at 30. Not because the facts of their history have changed, but because he is no longer inside the wound in the same way. And he can see his father's choices now as the choices of a man doing his best with what he had, rather than as the source code of his own deficiencies. The Lake Como villa still exists. He has owned it since 1994. The year ER arrived, and the world decided who he was. The stone walls and the cypress trees, and the water that changes color through the afternoon, have witnessed more versions of George Clooney than any biography has captured. He wants the twins to understand, one day, what it felt like to sit on that terrace at dusk after a day of filming in 1996, when the career was still uncertain and the world was still deciding. What it felt like to bring Amal there for the first time. What it felt like to walk its rooms in the weeks after the accident, and when the body was still unreliable, and the question of how much time remained felt less abstract than it ever had before. He wants them to understand that the legacy is not the Oscar or the billion-dollar tequila or the magazine covers. The legacy is the teacher in the refugee camp, the journalist who is free because someone paid for the defense, the child in a classroom that did not exist 3 years ago, and Alexander and Ella eating cereal at a breakfast table in the hills above Los Angeles, entirely unimpressed by their father's filmography. There is a photograph that circulates occasionally in the quieter corners of celebrity coverage. It was taken in 2019, during a school event in Los Angeles. George Clooney is sitting in a small plastic chair, the kind designed for 7-year-olds, entirely unsuitable for a 6-foot man with a reconstructed knee. Watching a children's performance with the complete, undivided attention of someone who has nowhere else to be. He is not performing presence. He is simply present. It is, in its own quiet way, the most radical thing George Clooney has ever done. More radical than the Darfur testimony. More radical than the handcuffs outside the embassy. More radical than the billion-dollar tequila, or the Venice wedding, or the Oscar acceptance speech. Because this is the man who spent 12 years being invisible in Los Angeles, and decided that invisibility would not be his final word, who spent 20 years constructing elegant distance from intimacy and discovered that the distance was the problem, not the solution, who spent 35 years building an empire and then, in a Sardinian hospital with a torn knee and a suddenly clarified sense of proportion, understood what the empire was for. He is sitting in a small plastic chair, watching his children perform, with his knee aching and his silver hair, and his 63 years of accumulated instruction. And he is, by every available measure, exactly where he wants to be. The boy from Kentucky, who drove to Los Angeles with $300 and a stubborn refusal to accept invisibility, did not end up where he planned. He ended up somewhere considerably more difficult to achieve and considerably more worth having. Not the most powerful man in any room. Not the most recognized face in any crowd. Not the most awarded, the most bankable, the most talked about. Just a man, present, paying attention, doing the voices at bedtime, choosing, every morning, the building over the scaffolding. That, in the end, is the story the spotlight never told. And perhaps the only one that truly matters. If George Clooney's journey has taught you anything, about patience, about conviction, about the courage to change your mind, share it in the comments below. Subscribe for more untold chapters. And remember that the most enduring legacies are rarely the loudest ones. They are the ones built quietly, in the presence of the people who need you most.